The silence in the car on the way home from the Founders' Day Gala was a living thing. It sat between my husband, Arthur, and me, a third passenger made of 45 years of unspoken words, of tiny compromises and monumental disappointments. It was heavier than the winter coats we wore, thicker than the fog gathering on the Ohio country roads outside. My hands were folded in my lap, the fine-boned, wrinkled skin of them looking alien under the passing streetlights. I stared at them, focusing on the faint blue veins that mapped a life of service, a life of kneading dough, of wiping tears, of holding his hand through fevers and financial fears. Tonight, those hands felt empty. They felt useless. The gala was meant to be a celebration. Arthur's hardware business had sponsored the main tent for the 10th year running. He was a pillar of our small town, Maple Creek. And I, Eleanor, was his shadow. The dependable, smiling, gracefully aging wife. I had played the part so well for so long that I sometimes forgot where the role ended, and I began. I had picked out his suit, a handsome navy wool that brought out the silver at his temples. I had reminded him to take his blood pressure medication. I had stood by his side, smiling at the mayor, at the Henderson brothers, at young couples who looked at us as if we were a monument to enduring love. They saw the oak tree, but they didn't see the rot hollowing it out from the inside. The rot had a name tonight. Her name was Clara. She was the new manager of the town's only art gallery, a woman who had blown into Maple Creek like a vibrant autumn wind, all swirling scarves and loud, genuine laughter. She was 20 years younger than I was, with a mind full of poetry and a way of looking at Arthur as if he'd just hung the moon, not just sold a man a set of wrenches. I had watched them all night. It started with conversations, his head tilted towards hers, his laughter a little too loud, a little too boyish. I told myself I was being foolish. I was 71 years old. Jealousy was an emotion for the young, a foolish, undignified thing. But then the band started playing that old song, the one that had been our song, Unchained Melody. It had been playing on the radio of his beat-up Ford the night he proposed to me by Miller's Pond. I felt a faint stirring in my chest, a memory of the girl I was, and I turned to him, a soft smile on my lips, ready to ask him for a dance. But he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were on Clara, and without a moment's hesitation, he walked over to her, took her hand, and led her onto the dance floor. I stood there, a glass of lukewarm punch in my hand, and I watched them. It wasn't just a dance. It was a performance. He held her close, not in the respectful, friendly way a man of his standing dances with a younger woman. He held her the way he used to hold me. His hand was firm in the small of her back, his body moving with a grace I hadn't seen in decades. They laughed, their heads close together, whispering things I couldn't hear but could feel in the pit of my stomach. The world around me seemed to fade into a dull, humming blur. The chatter of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the bright lights of the marquee, it all became background noise to the silent scream building inside my chest. It felt as if every person in that room was watching me, the forgotten wife, standing alone while my husband rediscovered his youth in another woman's arms. He didn't look at me once, not a single glance over her shoulder to see if I was all right, if I was even still there. In that moment, on that polished dance floor under the soft glow of the fairy lights, I was nothing. I was a ghost at my own life's party. I had been erased. When the song ended, he walked her back to her table, his hand lingering on her arm a second too long. Only then did he seem to remember me, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on my frozen form. He walked over, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and, perhaps, a flicker of guilt. "Eleanor," he said, his voice cheerful. "Getting tired, dear? We can head home if you like." He hadn't even noticed. He hadn't seen the gaping wound he'd just torn open in the fabric of our life together. I simply nodded, unable to form words. I placed my untouched glass on a passing tray and allowed him to lead me out into the cold night air, my arm in his, a familiar gesture that now felt like a chain. And so, we sat in the car, enveloped in that terrible, breathing silence. He hummed the melody of the song he had just danced with her. He didn't realize he was humming the anthem of my heartbreak. I looked out my window at the dark, sleeping fields of our life, and I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the January ground that I could not spend another night in that house. I could not wake up in the morning and make him coffee, pretending that I had not been publicly, profoundly, and utterly annihilated. He had danced with her like I was nothing, and so, like nothing, I would vanish. The decision wasn't born of anger.
It was quieter than that.
It was the calm, clear-eyed acceptance of an ending. An ending he had choreographed, but one I would now direct. Back at the house, he went upstairs immediately, complaining of a headache. I heard the water running for his shower. The sounds of our life, so normal, so routine, were suddenly unbearable. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall felt like it was counting down the seconds of my old life. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, they were the sounds of a cage. I didn't pack much. What do you take with you when you leave a lifetime behind? I found an old leather satchel in the back of the hall closet, one we'd used for weekend trips when the children were small. I packed 3 changes of clothes, the comfortable, sensible things I wore for gardening. I took my mother's silver locket, the one with tiny, faded pictures of my parents inside. I walked into the study and looked at the rows of photo albums I had so meticulously curated over the years. Birthdays, Christmases, vacations to the lake. A history of us. I ran my fingers over a picture of Arthur and me on our wedding day. We were so young, so full of a fierce, unshakable belief in forever. I felt a pang of grief for that young girl, for her naive, beautiful hope. I went to the kitchen and found the old biscuit tin where I kept my runaway money, as I jokingly called it. It was cash I'd saved over decades, skimming a little from the grocery budget here, stashing away birthday money there. It wasn't much, just over $7,000, but it felt like a fortune. It was mine, the only thing in this house that was truly, completely mine. I sat at the kitchen table, the very same table where I'd helped our children, Michael and Sarah, with their homework, where I'd cried over bills, where Arthur and I had planned our future. I took a single sheet of notepaper and a pen. What do you write to a man after 45 years? How do you condense a lifetime of love and silence and resentment into a few sentences? I wrote, my hand surprisingly steady. Arthur, I saw you. I am gone. I didn't sign it with love. I didn't sign it at all. I folded the note and left it in the very center of the table, weighted down by the salt shaker. I took one last look around the house. The home I had built, filled with memories, polished with my own hands. Every object screamed a story. The faded armchair where I nursed my babies, the chip on the mantelpiece from Michael's toy car, the faint scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco clinging to the curtains. It was my heart, turned inside out and made of wood and plaster. And I was walking away from it. I slipped out the back door, the one that led to my garden. Even in the dead of winter, it was my sanctuary. I brushed my fingers against the brittle, sleeping stalks of my rose bushes. Goodbye, I whispered to them. The car keys were on the hook by the door. I took my old sedan, the reliable one, leaving him the newer, bigger truck. I started the engine, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness of the night. As I backed out of the driveway, I didn't look at the house. I couldn't. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, a dark, unknown ribbon stretching out before me. For the first time in 45 years, I had no destination, no one to answer to, no dinner to make. There was only the hum of the engine, the glow of the dashboard, and the terrifying, exhilarating emptiness of the road. I was Eleanor, and I was gone. The first 300 miles were a blur of hypnotic white lines on asphalt, punctuated by the harsh glare of passing headlights. I drove east, with no specific destination in mind, only a deep, primal need to put distance between myself and Maple Creek. The sun began to rise somewhere in Pennsylvania, painting the bleak winter sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. It was the first sunrise I had witnessed alone in a very, very long time. Usually, I'd be in the kitchen, the scent of brewing coffee filling the air, my thoughts already on Arthur's breakfast, on the day's chores, on the endless list of things that needed doing for everyone but me. I stopped at a small, roadside diner that smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth and ordered black coffee and toast. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, called me Han. No one had called me Han in years. To the world, I was Mrs. Thorne. To my children, I was Mom. To Arthur, I was just there, an assumed part of the landscape of his life. But here, in this anonymous diner, I was just a woman with gray hair and a worn-out coat, a Han in need of coffee. It felt strangely liberating. As I sipped the hot, bitter liquid, the reality of what I had done began to seep in. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over me. What was I thinking? I was 71 years old. I had left my home, my husband, my entire life, with nothing but a small bag and a tin of cash. My children, oh, my dear children. Sarah, with her kind heart and her constant worrying. Michael, so practical and steady, just like his father. What would they think? They would be frantic. They would call Arthur, and he would find the note. The thought of Arthur finding that note sent another tremor through me. I could picture it so clearly. He would come downstairs, expecting coffee, and find the kitchen cold and empty. He would see the folded paper on the table. His brow would furrow in confusion, then in irritation. Anger would likely be his first response. He would see my departure not as a cry of pain, but as an act of defiance and inconvenience. The deeper hurt, the profound loneliness that would eventually settle in the echoing silence of the house, that would come later. Or perhaps, I thought with a fresh stab of pain, it wouldn't come at all. I paid for my breakfast with a crumpled bill from the biscuit tin and got back on the road. The panic subsided, replaced by a dull, aching sadness. I let my mind drift back, not to the dance, but further. I thought about the early years of our marriage. The tiny apartment above the hardware store, the windows rattling whenever a truck rumbled by. We had nothing but each other, and it had felt like everything. We'd talk for hours, sharing dreams of a house with a big garden, of children laughing in the yard. He would tell me about his plans for the store, his eyes alight with ambition. And I would listen, my heart swelling with pride, believing in him so completely. We achieved all of it. We built the house, plank by plank. We had Michael, then Sarah 2 years later. His business thrived. We became the Thorns of Maple Creek, a name that meant something. But somewhere along the way, in the accumulating of things, we had lost the art of conversation. Our talks became about logistics, mortgage payments, school schedules, doctor's appointments. The dreams were replaced by duties. He got busier, more consumed by the store and the town council. My world, in turn, shrank to the confines of our home and garden. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly. I was content, or so I had told myself. I had found purpose in raising my children, in creating a warm and welcoming home. It was a good life, but it was a life lived in service to others. My own dreams, the half-formed idea of taking painting classes, of traveling to see the ocean, they were packed away like old photographs, stored in the attic of my mind to be looked at someday. But someday never came. The dance wasn't the cause, it was the catalyst. It was the sudden, brutal realization that I had become so invisible, my presence so taken for granted, that he could humiliate me in a room full of our friends and neighbors and not even be aware of it. He hadn't just danced with another woman. He had danced on the grave of the girl who had believed in him, the young woman who had built her entire world around him. He had shown me, in one careless, joyful spin on the dance floor, that girl was well and truly gone, and he hadn't even noticed her absence. I kept driving east. The landscape changed from the flat fields of Ohio to the rolling hills of Appalachia. I was running on instinct, a migratory bird following some unseen current. I remembered a holiday my family took when I was a little girl, before my father passed. We went to Maine. I couldn't have been more than 7, but the memory was sharp and clear. The smell of the salt in the air. The raw, booming sound of the ocean crashing against granite cliffs. The feeling of being so small in the face of something so vast and powerful. It was the furthest I had ever been from the landlocked world I knew.
And it was where I wanted to go now.
I found a small, coastal town on a map, a place called Seacliff Harbor. The name itself sounded like a promise of sanctuary. It took me 2 more days of driving, of sleeping in cheap, anonymous motels, of eating solitary meals in diners to get there. Each mile I drove, I felt a layer of my old life sloughing away. I was no longer Mrs. Thorne, the hardware store owner's wife. I was just Eleanor, a woman in a dusty sedan with Ohio plates, heading towards the sea. Seacliff Harbor was even more beautiful than my childhood memories of Maine. It was a jumble of weathered, salt-bleached houses clinging to a rocky coastline. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and brine. Gulls wheeled and cried overhead. I found a small, furnished cottage for rent at the edge of town, overlooking a gray, churning sea. The landlady, a no-nonsense woman named Agnes with a warm smile, asked no questions. She took my cash for the first month's rent and handed me a key. The cottage was simple. A small living area with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom with a window that looked directly out onto the ocean. It was sparse, a blank canvas. For the first few days, I did almost nothing. I sat in an old rocking chair by the window and watched the tide come in and go out. The rhythm of the waves was a balm to my frayed nerves. It was a constant, powerful, and indifferent force. It didn't care about my heartache, my 45 years of marriage, or the Founders' Day Gala. It simply was. And in its presence, my own turmoil began to feel smaller, more manageable. One morning, my phone, which I had kept turned off, buzzed with a low battery warning as I was charging it. My heart leaped into my throat. I saw the screen light up with a cascade of notifications. 37 missed calls, 22 from Sarah, 15 from Michael, and dozens of text messages. My fingers trembled as I opened Sarah's.
Mom?
Where are you? Dad is going out of his mind. Mom, please just let us know you're safe. We're so worried. Did something happen? Did you and Dad fight? Please call me. Michael's were more direct. Mom, this isn't funny. Call me or Sarah immediately. Dad found your note. What does it mean? What did he do? We're calling the police if we don't hear from you by tonight. I felt a surge of guilt so powerful it almost made me sick. I had been so consumed by my own pain that I hadn't fully considered the terror I would be inflicting on my children. But there were no missed calls from Arthur. Not one. He was communicating through our children, using them as his messengers. That small detail told me everything I needed to know. He was embarrassed. He was angry, but he was not yet broken enough to reach out to me himself. I took a deep breath and typed a short message, sending it to both Sarah and Michael. I am safe. I am okay. I just need some time. Please don't worry. I will call soon. I love you both. I turned the phone off again immediately after sending it, before they could reply, before they could call. It was a cowardly act, I knew, but it was also an act of self-preservation. I wasn't ready to hear their questions. I wasn't ready to explain a pain that was still too raw to be put into words. I needed this silence. I needed this space to find out who Eleanor was when no one else was in the room. That afternoon, I walked into town and found a small art supply shop. I bought a set of watercolor paints, some brushes, and a thick pad of paper. It had been nearly 50 years since I had last painted, but my hands remembered the feel of the brush. I took my supplies down to the rocky beach and sat on a piece of driftwood. I didn't try to paint the grand vista of the ocean. I painted the small things. The way the light hit a particular rock. The deep green of a clump of seaweed left behind by the tide. The intricate pattern on a seashell. As I mixed the colors, a peace I hadn't felt in years settled over me. Here, there were no expectations. No one to please. There was only the paper, the paint, and the sound of the sea. I was not a wife or a mother. I was a creator, capturing a small moment of beauty. For the first time since I'd left Ohio, I wasn't running from something. I was finally, tentatively, moving toward something. Myself. The days in Seacliff Harbor began to take on a gentle, quiet rhythm. My world, which had once revolved around the needs and schedules of others, now followed the tides. I woke with the pale dawn light, made myself a simple breakfast, and walked along the beach, collecting sea glass and oddly shaped stones. The biting sea air felt like it was scouring away years of accumulated dust from my soul. I spent my afternoons painting, losing hours to the delicate dance of water and pigment on paper. My small cottage was slowly filling with paintings of the sea in its many moods, stormy and gray, calm and silver, brilliant and blue under a rare winter sun. I began to have brief, friendly conversations with the locals. Agnes, my landlady, would stop by with a loaf of freshly baked bread. A fisherman named Silas would nod to me on my morning walks. I was an enigma to them, I'm sure, the quiet older woman from away, but they respected my privacy. Their simple, polite acknowledgments were enough. They saw me, not as an extension of Arthur, not as a matriarch, but as Eleanor, the woman who lived in the cottage by the point. This simple, unburdened identity felt like a gift. After 2 weeks of silence, I knew I had to call my children. The guilt was a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of my newfound peace. I bought a cheap prepaid phone from the general store so they wouldn't have my new number and walked to the end of the stone jetty, the wind whipping my hair around my face. I called Sarah first. She answered on the first ring, her voice a torrent of frantic relief and tearful questions. Mom. Oh, thank God. Where are you? Are you okay? Why did you leave? Dad, he's a wreck. A wreck. The word hung in the air between us. I tried to picture it. Arthur, the unshakable pillar of Maple Creek, a wreck. I'm fine, my love, I said, my own voice thick with emotion. I'm in a safe place. I needed to get away. Away from what? From Dad, she pressed, her voice trembling. What happened at the gala? He won't talk about it. He just paces around the house like a ghost. He looks old, Mom. He looks lost. I closed my eyes, the image she painted causing a familiar ache in my chest. This was the man I had loved, the man whose vulnerabilities I knew better than my own. But that love was now tangled with the sharp, cold wire of betrayal. He knows what happened, I said softly. Ask him. Ask him about the dance. Our conversation was long and difficult. I reassured her that I was safe, that I had money, that I was not in any trouble. But I couldn't give her the answers she desperately wanted. I couldn't tell her where I was or when or if I was coming back. To do so would be to retether myself to the life I had so deliberately cut myself off from. Before we hung up, she said something that stayed with me. You know, Mom, in all the years, I never once saw you put yourself first. Not once. I don't understand why you left, but I hope you're finding whatever it is you're looking for. Her understanding, her tentative permission, was a crack of light in my wall of guilt. My call with Michael was different. He was more pragmatic, less emotional. Mom, what's the plan here? He asked, his voice businesslike, just like his father's. Are you getting a divorce? Do you need a lawyer? Dad's a mess. The store is suffering. He can't focus. There is no plan, Michael, I answered honestly. The plan is to breathe. The plan is to be quiet for a while. He misses you, Michael said, a statement of fact. He misses his routine. I corrected, a bit more sharply than I intended. He misses the woman who ran his house and organized his life, so he didn't have to. It's not the same thing as missing me, the person. The silence on his end told me my words had hit their mark. I ended the call promising to stay in touch, my heart heavy but also strangely lighter. I had spoken a truth I had been swallowing for years. Life continued. A month passed, then another. The harshness of winter began to soften. I saw the first crocuses pushing their way through the thawing earth in Agnes's garden. I had developed a tentative friendship with her. We'd share a cup of tea in the afternoons. She was a widow, her husband lost to the sea years ago. She spoke of him with a mixture of profound love and clear-eyed realism. She understood loss, but she also understood independence. She never pried into my past, but one afternoon, as we sat watching the waves, she said, "Sometimes the biggest storms aren't out there. They're the ones we carry inside. It takes a lot of courage to sail out of them." I knew she understood more than she let on. One afternoon, I received a letter. It was forwarded by Sarah, the envelope addressed in her familiar, looping script. Inside was another envelope, addressed to me in Arthur's shaky, almost illegible handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was the first direct communication I had received from him in almost 3 months. The letter was not what I expected. There was no anger, no demands. It was just a few short, clumsy paragraphs. "Eleanor," it began, "the house is too quiet. I keep listening for your footsteps on the stairs, but they're never there. I never noticed how many things you did until you stopped doing them. The roses in your garden are starting to bud. I don't know how to take care of them. Michael told me what you said, that I miss my routine. Maybe you're right, but you were my routine. For 45 years. I was a fool, Eleanor. A blind, arrogant fool. I remember the dance. I remember it all now. I just want you to come home." I read the letter a dozen times. Each word was a tiny pinprick in my carefully constructed piece. The man who wrote this letter was not the confident, commanding Arthur who had led Clara onto the dance floor. This was the younger man I had married, the one who was sometimes lost and unsure. The mention of the roses, my roses, was a calculated blow to my heart. He knew they were my pride, my joy. For the first time since I'd left, I felt a powerful, undeniable pull towards home. I thought of my own bed, the familiar weight of the quilts. I thought of my kitchen, with everything in its rightful place. I thought of the life I had so painstakingly built. Was I really going to throw it all away because of one dance? Because of a moment of foolish, late-life vanity on his part? Doubt, a cold and insidious sea fog, began to roll in. Had I overreacted? Had I been selfish, leaving my family in such turmoil? I spent the next few days in a state of confusion, my peaceful routines feeling hollow and pointless. The joy I had found in painting vanished. The sea, which had been my comfort, now seemed vast and lonely. I was sitting by the window, Arthur's letter in my lap, when Agnes knocked on the door. She took one look at my face and said, "Time for tea. My place." As she poured the steaming liquid into her chipped porcelain cups, she said simply, "You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost from a past life, perhaps, I murmured, and then the story poured out of me. The gala, the dance, the note, the silent drive into the unknown. I told her everything. She listened patiently, her gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, she didn't offer platitudes or easy advice. She just stirred her tea and said, "My Frank, he was a good man, the best, but he was a man of the sea. He knew the currents, the winds, the moods of the water, but the currents inside his own house, he was blind to them. I had to learn to navigate my own ship, even while his was tied up at the same dock." It sounds to me like you've just learned to build your own boat, Eleanor. The question isn't whether you should go back to his harbor. It's whether he's willing to learn to sail with you in new waters. Her words were like a lighthouse beam cutting through my fog of confusion. She was right. The issue wasn't about going back. The old harbor, the old life was gone. It had been shattered that night. The only question was what, if anything, could be built in its place. Going home meant returning to the role of the invisible wife, the caretaker of his comfort, the silent partner. Staying here meant what? A life of solitude? A life of painting and quiet walks. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ocean outside my window was restless, the waves crashing against the shore with a violent, relentless energy that mirrored the turmoil in my heart. I thought about Arthur's letter. I was a fool. An admission, yes, but not an explanation. Not a true understanding of the depth of the wound. He missed what I did for him. Did he miss who I was? I finally got out of bed, switched on a lamp, and took out a fresh sheet of my watercolor paper. This time I didn't paint the sea. I sketched my own face, using a small hand mirror. I painted the lines around my eyes, the silver in my hair. the quiet sadness, and the newfound strength I saw there. I painted Eleanor, and as I looked at the finished portrait, I knew my answer. I could not go back to being a ghost. The next morning, I used my prepaid phone, and I called him. It was early. I knew he'd be awake, sitting alone in the quiet kitchen. He answered on the first ring, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't used it all morning. Eleanor. Hello, Arthur. I said, my voice clear and steady. The sound of his name on my own lips felt foreign. Are you coming home? He asked, the hope in his voice so naked it was painful to hear. I received your letter, I said, sidestepping his question. I want to talk, Arthur. Really talk. Not in our house. Not in Maple Creek. Here. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing. Here? Where is here? I'm in a small town on the coast of Maine, I told him. I will send you the address. You can come here if you want to, but you will come alone. And you will come to my space, on my terms. It was an ultimatum, the first I had ever given him in our entire marriage. It was a monumental risk. He could refuse. He could get angry. He could hang up the phone and my new, fragile world could come crashing down, leaving me truly, utterly alone. I held my breath, waiting for his response, the sound of the distant waves filling the silence. His answer would decide everything. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. I could hear the faint, familiar sounds of our kitchen in Ohio, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant chime of the grandfather clock. Sounds that had once been the soundtrack to my life now seemed like echoes from another world. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had laid down my terms. I had drawn a line in the sands of my new shore, and I had no idea if he would be willing to cross it. Finally, his voice came, quieter than I'd ever heard it. Maine, he said, as if tasting the word. You always wanted to see the ocean again. His remembering that small, forgotten detail, a dream I had mentioned decades ago and then buried under layers of family life and responsibility, was more disarming than any apology. It was a flicker of the man I had first loved, the one who listened. Yes, I said, my own voice softening. I did. All right, Eleanor, he said, and I could hear the weariness and the resolve in his tone. All right.
Send me the address.
I'll come. After I hung up, I sat in the rocking chair for a long time, watching the gulls dive for fish in the churning surf. A storm of emotions was raging inside me. Terror, relief, apprehension, and a strange, unfamiliar surge of power. For 45 years, our life had been dictated by his needs, his business, his world. I had traveled to his side. Now he was being asked to travel to mine. It was a fundamental shift in the geography of our marriage. I sent the address to Michael and asked him to give it to his father. I didn't want to speak to Arthur again until he was standing on my doorstep. I needed the space to prepare myself. In the 3 days it took for him to make the drive from Ohio, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I painted with a frantic energy, trying to pour all my anxiety and hope onto the paper. I walked for miles along the coastline, letting the wind and the salt spray clear my head. Agnes seemed to sense the shift in me. She didn't ask questions, but she left a thermos of hot chowder on my porch one evening, a silent gesture of support that meant the world to me. The day he was due to arrive, I woke up feeling a profound sense of calm. I had done what I needed to do. I had found a piece of myself that I thought was lost forever. Whatever happened next, I would not lose her again. I saw his truck pull up late in the afternoon. It looked so out of place, so large and landlocked, against the backdrop of the sea. He got out slowly, like an old man, and stood for a moment, looking at my little cottage, then at the vast expanse of the ocean behind it. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished without the familiar setting of Maple Creek to frame him. He wore a rumpled travel shirt, and his face was etched with lines of fatigue and worry that I had never seen before. I opened the door before he could knock. We stood there for a moment, two strangers who had shared a bed and a life for nearly half a century. The silence was thick with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said. Eleanor, he said, his voice husky. Arthur, I replied. You should come in. He stepped inside, his eyes taking in the small, simple room. They lingered on the paintings that were stacked against the walls, dozens of them, all of the sea and the shore. You've been painting, he said, a note of surprise in his voice. Yes, I said. I have. I made us tea, the movements familiar but the context alien. We sat at the small kitchen table, which felt miles apart. He looked out the window at the water. I never understood, he began, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. I never understood what I had. It was just life. It was the air I breathed. I didn't think about the air until I couldn't breathe anymore. That house, our home, it's just a building without you in it, Eleanor. It has no spirit. I let him talk. He spoke of the emptiness, the silence, the crushing weight of his own carelessness. He finally told me about the dance. He didn't make excuses. He said he'd felt old and invisible, and Clara's attention had made him feel seen. And you didn't think for one moment how it would make me feel? I asked, my voice quiet, but the question was as sharp as a shard of sea glass. Standing there, watching you with her, in front of the whole town? He finally looked at me, and I saw tears welling in his eyes. It was a sight so rare, I couldn't remember the last time I had seen him cry. No, he admitted, his voice breaking. I didn't, and that is the crime of it. I didn't think of you at all. I just took you for granted. I assumed you would always be there, in your usual spot, smiling. It was the most selfish, most terrible thing I have ever done. And I am so sorry. The apology was real. I could hear it. I could see it in the profound shame on his face. And a part of me, the wife of 45 years, wanted to reach across the table, take his hand, and say, "It's all right. Let's go home." But the woman I had become, the Eleanor of Seacliff Harbor, held back. I accept your apology, Arthur. I said, and I meant it. But I cannot go home. The hope drained from his face, leaving it gray and old. What does that mean? Is it over?
Us.
The us we were is over. I said, my voice gentle but firm. It ended that night. The woman you took for granted, the woman who organized her entire existence around you, she doesn't live here anymore. I don't think she even exists. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at my ocean. I have found something here, Arthur. A quietness, a sense of my own self. I am not just a wife or a mother anymore. I am Eleanor. I paint. I walk on the beach. I listen to the tide. I don't know if I can give that up. I don't want you to give it up, he said desperately, coming to stand beside me. Bring it home with you. We can change. I can change. I turned to face him. Change is not a promise, Arthur. It's a practice. For years, our life has been a one-way street. All the traffic flowed from me to you. I can't live on that street anymore. If there is to be a future for us, it has to be a new road. One we build together. We talked for hours, long into the night, as the tide went out and came back in again. It was the most honest conversation we had had in our entire marriage. We spoke of our resentments, our disappointments, our faded dreams. We unburied decades of silence. In the end, there were no easy answers. I did not pack my bags and get in his truck. And he did not turn around and drive back to Ohio alone. We reached a new kind of compromise, an arrangement that belonged to this new world we were in. He rented a room at the small inn in town for a week. Every day, he would come to my cottage, and we would simply spend time together. We walked on the beach, and I showed him the best places to find sea glass. I taught him the names of the different shorebirds. He told me about the struggles at the store, not as a boss telling his subordinate, but as a man sharing his burdens with his partner. One afternoon, he brought over a canvas and some paints he'd bought at the general store, and he sat beside me on the beach, awkwardly trying to capture the likeness of a fishing boat. He was terrible at it, but he was trying. He was entering my world, seeing through my eyes. It was a beginning. When the week was over, he had to go back to Ohio, back to his responsibilities. The parting at my cottage door was bittersweet and uncertain. Will you think about coming home? He asked, his hand on the doorknob. I will think about what home means now, I answered. And I will call you. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't kiss me. It wasn't time for that yet. But he reached out and gently touched one of my paintings that was propped on a chair. This is beautiful, Eleanor, he said. You are beautiful. And then he was gone. I am still here, in my cottage in Seacliff Harbor. It has been 6 months since his visit. We talk on the phone every few days. The conversations are different now.
Deeper.
He tells me about the things he's noticing for the first time. The way the light falls in the kitchen in the morning, the sound the house makes when it's empty. He tells me he's learning to cook and that he burned the first 3 meals he attempted. He has hired someone to tend to my roses. I have sold a few of my paintings at the local gallery, the one managed by a woman much kinder than Clara. I have a small circle of friends. My life is my own. I don't know what the future holds. Perhaps one day I will go back to Maple Creek for a visit. Perhaps Arthur will spend more time here, by the sea. Perhaps we will find a new way to be together, a way that honors both of us. Or perhaps we will find that our paths have diverged for good. The ending to our story has not yet been written. But what I do know is this. I am no longer invisible. I am no longer a ghost in my own life. That night, when Arthur danced with another woman as if I were nothing, he thought he was erasing me. He didn't realize that he was, in fact, setting me free. Free to vanish. Yes, but also free to reappear, somewhere new, somewhere quiet, somewhere where I could finally see myself. And I look out at the endless, powerful ocean, and I know, with a certainty that fills my entire being, that I am more than enough. The rhythm of my days in Seacliff Harbor had become as familiar and comforting as the ebb and flow of the tide itself. The summer had been a revelation, a season of long, sun-drenched days spent painting on the cliffs, my skin growing warm and weathered, my hands stained with ultramarine and ochre. I had made friends, real friends, not just the wives of Arthur's business associates. There was Agnes, of course, my steadfast landlady. And there was Ben, the retired sea captain who ran the small bookstore in town, with whom I shared a love for old poetry and quiet conversation. My life was small, but it was profoundly and entirely my own. My phone calls with Arthur continued, evolving from tentative, painful explorations of the past into something new. He had stopped pleading for me to come home and had started, instead, to ask about my life in Maine. He wanted to know about my paintings, about the books Ben recommended, about the temperamental weather of the Atlantic coast. He would tell me about his days, too, but in a different way than before. He spoke of the loneliness of walking through the hardware store he had built, of the customers who asked after me with concerned eyes. He confessed that for years, he had seen our life together as a great edifice he had constructed, never realizing that I was the one who had laid the foundation, mortared the bricks, and tended the hearth that made it a home. He was a man slowly, painstakingly learning a language he had never bothered to speak, the language of introspection. One crisp afternoon in early October, with the scent of wood smoke and salt in the air, a thick envelope arrived, forwarded by Sarah. Inside was a heavy, cream-colored invitation. My granddaughter, Lily, Sarah's eldest, was getting married. The date was set for the first Saturday in December, back in Ohio. My heart did a complicated, painful twist. Lily was my first grandchild, the bright star of my later years. I had taught her how to bake, how to identify the birds in our garden. The thought of missing her wedding was an agony I hadn't anticipated. Tucked inside the invitation was a handwritten note from Lily herself. Grandma, it read, I know things are complicated. Mom has explained, well, she's tried to. But I can't imagine getting married without you there. You are my anchor. Please think about coming home for it. The wedding wouldn't be the same without you. Grandpa, he just wanders around the house. He misses you so much. We all do. Her words were a direct hit, a torpedo to the hull of the sturdy ship I had built for myself here in Maine. For all my newfound independence, I was still a mother, a grandmother. The pull of family was a current far stronger than any tide. I spent days in turmoil, walking the windswept beach for hours, The wedding invitation, a heavy weight in my coat pocket. To go back meant re-entering the world that had so thoroughly broken me. It meant facing the whispers, the curious stares. It meant sleeping under the same roof as Arthur, in the house that held 45 years of ghosts. But to stay away felt like a punishment, not to Lily, but to myself. It would mean I was still in hiding, still so fragile that I couldn't bear to face my own past. It would mean that my escape had become its own kind of prison. The Eleanor of Seacliff Harbor, the woman who painted the stormy sea, was not a coward. I called Arthur that evening. I received Lily's invitation. I said, my voice neutral. There was a pause. I was hoping you would, he said softly. Will you come? Yes, I said. I will be there for Lily. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the next part. But I need you to understand a few things, Arthur. I will be driving myself. I am not coming home to stay. I am coming as a guest for the wedding. I would like to stay in our house, but I will be sleeping in the guest room. Another long silence. I was setting boundaries, building new walls within our old home. It was a test. His reaction would tell me if he had truly been listening all these months. Of course, Eleanor, he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. Whatever you need. The guest room will be ready. Just having you in the house will be enough. His easy acceptance was both a relief and a new kind of sorrow. It was an admission of how much the power dynamic between us had shifted. He was no longer the king in his castle, but a supplicant waiting for a visitor. The long drive back to Ohio was the inverse of my flight to the sea. This time, I wasn't running away. I was driving toward a confrontation with my former life. The flat, familiar landscape of the Midwest no longer felt like a cage, but like a place I simply used to know. As I drove, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were a visitor from another country, returning to my homeland after years abroad, able to see both its beauty and its flaws with fresh eyes. When I finally turned onto our street in Maple Creek, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. Everything looked exactly the same, yet fundamentally different. The Hendersons' house still needed a coat of paint. Mrs. Gable's prize-winning pumpkins were still on her porch. And there it was, our house. The large, sturdy colonial we had built together. My roses, which Arthur had apparently hired a gardener to tend, were pruned back for the winter, their thorny canes reaching up like skeletal fingers. Arthur was waiting on the porch. He watched as I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. I sat for a moment in the silence of the car, gathering my strength. Then I got out. He didn't rush toward me. He just stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, looking older and more tired than he had in Maine. Hello, Eleanor, he said as I walked up the stone path. Hello, Arthur, I replied. The air between us was charged, electric with all the things we couldn't say. He reached for my bag, and I let him take it. As we stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house washed over me, a mixture of lemon oil, old books, and the faint, lingering aroma of his pipe tobacco. It was the scent of my entire adult life. For a heart-stopping moment, I felt the urge to weep, to fall back into the comfort of the known, to forget the last 9 months and pretend nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I had changed. He led me upstairs. The house was immaculately clean, almost sterile. I had a service come, he said, as if reading my mind. I didn't know how to keep up with it all. The guest room was at the end of the hall. It was a lovely room, with pale yellow walls and a view of the back garden. It was also the room furthest from the master bedroom. He placed my bag on the floor. The bed has fresh linens, he said. If you need anything, just let me know. The formality was staggering. We were like two polite strangers in a bed and breakfast. But it was a necessary formality. It was the space I had asked for, the boundary I needed. That first night was one of the strangest of my life. I lay awake in the guest bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the groan of the furnace, the ticking of the clock, the sound of Arthur moving about in the bedroom down the hall. It was a symphony of a life that was no longer mine, and I felt a profound and aching loneliness, not for the life I had lost, but for the life I had built for myself by the sea. The days leading up to the wedding were a careful, delicate dance. Arthur and I moved around each other with a cautious courtesy that was both comforting and heartbreaking. He made coffee in the morning, leaving a mug on the counter for me before he left for the store. I would make my own simple breakfast and spend my time reading or walking in the crisp December air. We were two planets in a shared orbit, held together by the gravity of our history, but keeping a safe, calculated distance. Seeing my children was the true homecoming. Sarah enveloped me in a hug so tight it stole my breath, her tears wetting the shoulder of my coat. "Oh, Mom," she whispered. "It's so good to have you here. You look different. You look peaceful." Michael, ever my stoic son, simply held my arm and said, "We missed you, Mom." In their eyes, I saw not just relief, but a new kind of respect. I was no longer just their mother, the constant, reliable fixture of their lives. I was a woman who had a story, a woman who had acted on her own behalf. Lily was radiant, a flurry of youthful excitement and pre-wedding nerves. She clung to me, asking my opinion on her veil, on the seating chart, on 100 tiny details. It was in these moments that I felt the pull of my old role most acutely. It would have been so easy to step in, to take over, to manage the chaos as I had always done. But I consciously held back. I offered advice when asked, but I did not direct. I listened more than I spoke. I watched as Sarah and even Arthur stepped up to handle the logistics. It was a subtle but seismic shift. I was present, but I was no longer the engine of the family. The town of Maple Creek was another matter. My return had not gone unnoticed. A trip to the grocery store felt like running a gauntlet of curious glances and hushed whispers. I held my head high, offering polite but brief greetings to the people I had known for decades. I knew what they were thinking. They were wondering where I had been, what had happened between Arthur and me. They were looking for the cracks in our carefully constructed facade. The inevitable happened on the third day. I was in the bakery, picking up a cake for the rehearsal dinner, when the bell above the door jingled and Clara walked in. My breath caught in my throat. She was just as I remembered. Vibrant, confident, her scarf artfully arranged around her neck. She stopped short when she saw me. A flicker of something, surprise, guilt, embarrassment, crossed her face before she composed herself. The old Eleanor would have shrunk, would have paid for her things and scurried out, burning with humiliation. But the Eleanor who had spent months listening to the Atlantic Ocean was made of sterner stuff. I gave her a small, calm smile. "Hello, Clara," I said, my voice even. "Eleanor," she said, her own voice a little too bright. "Mrs. Thorne, it's good to see you back."
"Thank you," I said.
"It's nice to be back for my granddaughter's wedding." I deliberately emphasized the temporary nature of my visit. We stood in an awkward silence for a moment. The air crackled with the unspoken history between us. Then she did something I didn't expect. She took a step closer and lowered her voice. "Listen," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "About the Founders Gala. I was out of line. Arthur, he was charming, and I got carried away. I heard you left town right after. I hope it wasn't because of me." It was a clumsy, self-serving apology, but it was an apology nonetheless. I looked at this woman, 20 years my junior, a woman who had been the catalyst for the complete upheaval of my life. And I felt nothing. The rage, the jealousy, the searing pain that had driven me across 3 states, it was all gone. It had been washed away by the tides, replaced by something quieter and much more powerful. What happened that night was between my husband and me, I said, my voice gentle but clear. It had very little to do with you, really. You were just a symptom of a much older illness. But thank you. I wish you well. And with that, I picked up my cake box, nodded to her, and walked out of the bakery into the cold winter air, my heart steady and calm. I had not won a victory over her. I had won a victory over the woman I used to be. I had faced the ghosts that haunted me, and I had not flinched. That night, I told Arthur about the encounter. We were sitting in the living room, a rare moment of shared quiet. He listened, his face grim. "What a mess I made," he said, shaking his head. To put you through that. To put you in a position where you would even have to have that conversation. It's all right, Arthur, I said, and for the first time, I felt a stirring of genuine compassion for him, for the foolish, aging man who had been so afraid of his own mortality. That chapter is over. For me, at least. The night of the rehearsal dinner, Arthur and I arrived together. We presented a united front to the world, a portrait of a long-married couple celebrating their family. But we both knew it was a performance, though a much more honest one than the roles we had played for years. Later that evening, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, he found me in the kitchen, staring out at the dark, frozen garden. "You know," he said, his voice soft behind me, "I never once came out to the garden with you. Not really. It was always your space. I'd watch you from this window, but I never joined you. I don't think I knew how. You just have to walk through the door," I said, not turning around. "I'm trying, Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I'm trying to learn how to walk through the door." I turned then and looked at him. The space between us felt smaller, the distance less vast. For the first time since my return, I saw a glimmer of a possible future, a new garden we might, perhaps, learn to tend together. The wedding was the next day, and I knew it would be the ultimate test, a final reckoning with the past, and a turning point for whatever was to come. The day of the wedding dawned cold and bright, a perfect winter morning. The house buzzed with a joyful, chaotic energy that felt both familiar and strange. Sarah and the bridesmaids fluttered around Lily, a vision in ivory lace, her face alight with a mixture of nerves and pure happiness. I watched from the periphery, a quiet observer, my heart swelling with love for this family I had created. I helped Lily with the antique silver locket I had given her, my mother's locket, the same one I had carried with me to Maine. "Something old," I whispered, my fingers fumbling with the delicate clasp. She squeezed my hand, her eyes shining. "Thank you for being here, Grandma. It means everything." At the church, I walked down the aisle on Michael's arm. A matriarch returned. I could feel the eyes of the congregation on me, on Arthur, who was already seated in the front pew. I took my place beside him, leaving a small but deliberate space between us. He didn't try to close the gap. He simply gave me a small, questioning look, and I offered a slight nod in return. We were a team for today. For Lily, the ceremony was beautiful. Watching my granddaughter pledge her life to a fine young man, I was struck by the raw, untempered hope of new love. It was a hope I remembered well, a hope I had once felt in this very same church, standing beside a younger Arthur. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, a grief for the years we had lost to silence and misunderstanding. But as I glanced at the man beside me, at his wrinkled hand resting on his knee, at the way his eyes glistened as he watched his granddaughter, the sadness was tempered by something else. A quiet acceptance. Our story wasn't one of youthful hope anymore. It was something more complex, more weathered, and perhaps more resilient. The reception was held at the Old Country Club, the very place where the Founders' Day Gala had taken place. As we walked in, my stomach tightened. The room was transformed with flowers and candlelight, but the ghosts were still there. I could see the dance floor, the spot where I had stood, frozen and alone. I took a steadying breath, reminding myself that I was not the same woman who had fled this room in silent agony. I mingled. I laughed. I accepted compliments on how well I looked. I spoke with old friends, answering their gentle, probing questions with vague but pleasant truths. I needed a change of scenery. I'd say with a smile. The sea air did me a world of good. I was protecting my own story, my own hard-won peace. Arthur was a revelation. He stayed by my side, but not in a possessive way. He was attentive. He brought me a glass of punch. He introduced me into conversations, not as my wife, but as Eleanor. He would say things like, "Eleanor has been doing some remarkable painting in Maine. You should see her work." He was seeing me, and he was making sure others saw me, too. Then the band started to play. The music swirled around us, and couple after couple made their way to the dance floor. Lily and her new husband, my children, old friends. I watched them, content to be a spectator. I had no desire to relive that particular trauma. After a few songs, a slow, familiar melody began. It wasn't our song. It was something else, something gentle and unassuming. Arthur turned to me, his face serious, his eyes full of a quiet, desperate plea. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low so only I could hear, "may I have this dance?" My first instinct was to say no. To refuse was to protect myself, to maintain the final boundary. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw not the arrogant man from the gala, but a penitent one, a man asking for a chance not to erase the past, but to write a new line. "All right, Arthur," I said softly. He led me onto the floor. He didn't pull me close. He placed his hand gently on my back, leaving a respectful distance between us. He held my other hand, as if it were a fragile seashell. We began to move, slowly, awkwardly at first, two people relearning the steps to a dance they had forgotten how to do. We didn't speak for the first minute. We just moved to the music, surrounded by the warmth and celebration of our family. The ghosts in the room began to recede, replaced by the living, breathing reality of this moment. "I never told you," he said finally, his voice a low rumble near my ear. "After you left, I found your biscuit tin in the kitchen cupboard. It was empty, and I realized that for years you had been saving up your own escape, dollar by dollar. And I never saw that you needed a place to run to. That's the thing that haunts me the most, Eleanor. Not the dance, but the silence that came before it. The years of silence that made you feel you had to save up for your own life." Tears pricked my eyes. He understood. He finally truly understood. It wasn't about Clara. It was about the slow, creeping invisibility, the life lived in the margins of his own. "I wasn't saving to escape you, Arthur," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I think I was saving to find me." "Have you found her?" he asked, his gaze earnest and full of hope. I thought of my little cottage, of the smell of the salt and the sound of the waves. I thought of my paintings, of the quiet strength I had discovered within myself. "Yes," I said with a certainty that resonated deep in my soul. "I have." He nodded, a slow, sad smile touching his lips. "She's remarkable," he said. I hope I get the chance to know her better." The song ended. He didn't let go of my hand immediately. He just looked at me, a lifetime of regret and a glimmer of new hope passing between us. It wasn't a magical fix. The chasm that had opened between us would not be closed by a single dance. But it was a bridge. A first, tentative step across. We left the wedding early. As he drove, I stared out the window at the sleeping town of Maple Creek. It didn't feel like a cage anymore. It was just a place. A town with a hardware store, a bakery, and a church. A chapter in my story, but not the whole book. When we got back to the house, the silence felt different. Not empty, but peaceful. Contemplative. I made us both a cup of chamomile tea, and we sat at the kitchen table, the place where I had left my stark, 3-word note. "I'll be driving back to Maine in a few days," I said. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded. "I know," he said. Can I come and visit you? In the spring." "I'd like that," I said, and the words were true. "And maybe," he said, looking down at his hands, "maybe someday you'll think about spending the summers here in your garden. And we can spend the winters there, by your sea. We could have 2 homes. A new kind of life." It was a brave, audacious proposal. Not a demand to return to the old ways, but an offer to build something entirely new, a life that spanned both our worlds. A life where Eleanor of the garden and Eleanor of the sea could both exist. I didn't answer him right away. I just sipped my tea and looked at this man I had known for a lifetime, this stranger I was just getting to know. The future was still an uncharted ocean. There might be storms ahead. There might be shoals we couldn't navigate. But for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer afraid of the journey. I had my own ship now and my own compass, and I knew, whichever harbor I chose, I would be the captain of my own soul. The 2 days I spent in Maple Creek after the wedding were surreal. Arthur and I existed in a state of quiet truce, like two countries that had agreed to a ceasefire but had not yet signed the peace treaty. The proposal he had made, a life of two homes, of a shared future built on a new foundation, hung in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing I was not yet ready to touch. I needed the solitude of my own space, the sound of the ocean, to truly consider it. Our goodbyes were not said in the house, a place still too heavy with the ghosts of our shared past. He walked me out to my car in the cold morning light, the ground covered in a brittle lace of frost. He carried my small bag, the same one I had fled with all those months ago. "Drive safely, Eleanor," he said, his breath pluming in the air. "I will," I replied. There was a moment of hesitation, a space where a hug or a kiss would have once fit so easily. Now, it was a chasm of uncertainty. He simply reached out and placed his hand on my arm, his touch light, questioning. I did not pull away. I covered his hand with my own for a brief second, a small acknowledgement of the bridge he was trying to build. "I'll call you when I get there," I said. "I know you will," he answered, and in his eyes I saw not expectation but trust. A new and precious commodity between us. The drive back to Maine was a pilgrimage in reverse. The first time, I had been running from a life that had suffocated me. This time, I was returning to a life that had taught me how to breathe. The flat, dormant fields of the Midwest slowly gave way to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania and the dense forests of New England. With each mile I traveled east, I felt the weight of Maple Creek, the burden of being Mrs. Arthur Thorne, lifting from my shoulders. I wasn't shedding a skin. I was simply returning to the one that fit me best. When I finally crossed the state line into Maine, I rolled down my window, even in the cold, and inhaled deeply. The air was different here. It was sharp, clean, laced with the promise of salt and pine. It smelled like freedom. Pulling into the gravel drive of my small cottage felt like a true homecoming. The weathered gray shingles, the small porch, the vast, churning expanse of the Atlantic just beyond. This was my sanctuary. This was the place where I had found myself. The winter months passed in a blur of peaceful solitude and quiet creativity. I painted with a passion I hadn't known since I was a girl, my little cottage overflowing with canvases that captured the raw, dramatic beauty of the coast in winter. The sea was my constant companion, its moods ranging from a violent, slate-gray fury to a placid, metallic stillness. It was a perfect mirror for the complex emotions that still churned within me. I fell into a comfortable routine with my small circle of friends. I'd have tea with Agnes every Tuesday, her warm, no-nonsense wisdom a steadying presence. On Fridays, I would visit Ben at his bookstore, and we would spend hours talking about literature, history, and the quiet joys of a life lived simply. He never asked about my past, but one afternoon, as he was wrapping a book of Mary Oliver poems for me, he said, "It seems to me, Eleanor, that you are a woman who has finally given herself permission to read her own story." I knew then that he understood everything. My phone calls with Arthur were the one consistent thread connecting me to my old life. But the thread was being rewoven into something new. We spoke of practical things. He was having the big house in Ohio appraised, an acknowledgement that it was too much for one person. He told me, with a note of pride in his voice, that he had learned how to make my pot roast recipe, though it had taken him 4 tries to get it right. He was learning the vocabulary of the life I had always managed for him. More importantly, he began to enter my world. I had left a few of my books on birds and wildflowers at the house, and he started to use them. He would call and describe a bird at the feeder with a child's sense of wonder. "It has a bright red head, and it makes a sound like a squeaky gate. What do you suppose it is?" he'd ask. And I would tell him it was a woodpecker, and we would talk about it, a simple, shared moment of discovery that felt more intimate than many of the conversations we'd had in 45 years of marriage. I sent him photos of my paintings. He would call me after receiving them, his voice full of genuine awe. "I don't understand how you do it, Eleanor," he said once. "How you take just gray and white and blue and make it feel so alive." He was seeing my art. He was seeing me. As the winter ice began to thaw and the first brave buds appeared on the trees, he made his intentions clear. "I'd like to come in May," he said one evening. "Just for a week. If you'll have me." "I'd like that, Arthur," I said, and my heart, which I had so carefully guarded, felt a small, tentative flutter of anticipation. His arrival in the spring was vastly different from his first visit. He didn't seem like a stranger in a strange land this time. He seemed like a man arriving in a place he wanted to learn. He brought a small suitcase and a large, brand new bird feeder for my garden. It was a gesture that spoke volumes. He wasn't trying to impose his old life on my new one. He was trying to add to it. We spent the week in a quiet, comfortable rhythm. He didn't try to stay at the cottage. He took his same room at the inn, respecting the sanctity of my space. But he spent his days with me. We walked the beaches, and this time, he knew the names of the gulls and the sandpipers. I introduced him to Agnes, who sized him up with her shrewd, kind eyes and, to my relief, gave him a firm nod of approval. He spent an entire afternoon in Ben's bookstore, emerging with a stack of books on Maine's history. He was a man courting not just a woman, but her entire world. One evening, we cooked dinner together in my tiny kitchen. It was a clumsy ballet of bumped elbows and apologies, but we laughed. We made a simple meal of baked fish and roasted vegetables, and we ate at my small table, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. "I've put the house on the market," he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. I stopped, my fork halfway to my mouth. "Arthur, are you sure?" He looked at me, his eyes clear and steady in the fading light. "It's too much house, Eleanor. It's full of memories of a life that doesn't exist anymore. I want to make new memories." He reached across the table and, for the first time since I had left, he took my hand. His skin was rough and familiar. Our life, it was like that big, heavy oak table in the dining room. Solid, dependable, but impossible to move. I want a life we can carry with us. A life that fits in a small cottage by the sea and maybe a smaller place, a little condo back in Ohio so we can see the grandchildren. His vision for our future was a tangible thing now, a plan born not of desperation, but of careful, loving thought. He wasn't asking me to come back to his world. He was asking to build a new one with me, a world with two shores. "The real estate agent thinks it will sell quickly," he continued. I saw that this cottage is for sale. Agnes told me. I thought, maybe with the money from the house, we could buy it. It could be yours. Ours. A place to anchor. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. They weren't tears of sadness or of anger. They were tears of release. A release of decades of feeling unseen, of being taken for granted. This man, my husband, was finally seeing me in all my complexities. He wasn't just loving the ghost of the girl he had married. He was loving the woman I had become. "Yes," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Arthur. I think that is a wonderful idea. Our story is not a fairy tale. We are two old people, scarred and weathered by life and our own mistakes. The sale of the house in Maple Creek will be the final, painful, and necessary amputation of our old life. Finding a new, smaller home, there will be a challenge. Learning to live together again, even part-time, will require a patience and a grace we are only just beginning to learn. There will be days when old habits resurface, when the silence between us is tinged with the memory of past hurts. But today, Arthur is still here. He is asleep in his room at the inn, and I am sitting in my rocking chair, watching the first pale light of dawn touch the horizon. My cottage is quiet, filled with the scent of the sea and the lingering aroma of the meal we shared. My latest painting sits on the easel, a depiction of the ocean at dawn, all soft purples and promising golds. I came here to vanish. I came here seeking nothingness, an escape from a life where I had become invisible. I ran away from a man who danced with another woman because he had forgotten how to see the one who had stood by his side for a lifetime. But in the silence and the solitude, in the roar of the ocean and the cry of the gulls, I did not disappear. I found myself, and in doing so, I gave the man I loved the chance to find me, too. Our love story will not end with the passionate embrace of a young couple. It will continue in the quiet sharing of a newspaper in the morning, in the shared joy of spotting a rare bird, in the comfortable silence of two people sitting together, watching the tide come in. He had to lose me to learn how to see me, and I had to leave everything I knew to finally come home to myself. The ocean stretches out before me, vast and unknowable, and for the first time in my life, I am not afraid of the depths. I have found my anchor, and it was within me all along.